So I'm Peter Barrett. I'm a professor or an emeritus professor of property and construction management at Salford University. I originally trained as a surveyor, building surveyor, so done quite a lot of practical work, but got a bit more academic as time goes on. Well, we really wanted to study the impact of building spaces on people in general, but schools turned out to be a perfect place to do that because the children are in one room for a whole year, and there are good measures of how they're progressing academically at the beginning and the start of the year. Primary schools were particularly good because they don't move between classrooms. They literally spend most of the year in a single space. And so the characteristics of that space, if it has an impact, should show up. So there's been lots of studies done of schools, but generally speaking, people have looked at schools as a whole and the performance of all the children in a school as a whole. Whereas actually to really understand the effect of the spaces, you need to look at individual classrooms. And so we looked at a lot of classrooms. We looked at 153 individual classrooms. We looked at 3,766 pupils in those classrooms. And we were able to separate out the characteristics of the children and that impact from the impacts of the spaces. So it had to be a big study to work statistically, and it had to be at a level of detail where the individual classroom characteristics would come out. When we were looking at the classrooms, we were looking at the normal things that people do look at. So we were looking at temperature, we were looking at light, we were looking at air quality, we were looking at the acoustics. But we also extended beyond that because we were looking at all of the sensory impacts. So we also looked at the level of stimulation provided by colour and the visual complexity of the space. And we also looked at a novel aspect, which is the individualization of the space, which is the degree to which the pupils can feel it's their space. It's not an anonymous box. It actually really is a place where they can feel at home. There are various approaches you could take, but it is a really, really knotty problem because there are lots of factors at play, and we wanted to link it to a real thing that matters to people, which in this case was academic progress. That's something which is typically measured over a year. The children are in the same space for a year, and so we decided to take that duration, measure their progress at the beginning and the end of the year, and to know everything we could about the space they were in for that time. And if we did that, we actually maximised our chances of being able to identify the impact of the spaces. The headline finding was that the variations in the physical characteristics of the spaces explain 16% of the variation in the learning progress of the children in those spaces. So that actually is a number. It's hard to know whether it's a big number or a small number until you say, well, we actually know that 70% of the variation was connected to the characteristics of the children themselves. So actually the physical spaces are explaining half of the remaining variability. It's hugely important, and it's actually much bigger than we expected it to be. In terms of the relative impact of the different aspects of the space, light had the biggest impact. This is artificial and natural, and it's to do with shading, so it's always complicated. But the answer actually is that no single thing had a massive impact over and above everything else. In fact, it was a whole bunch of 7 different factors that together had a really big impact. And what this means is, I suppose, that there's a huge design challenge to try and maximise on all of these fronts at the same time and come up with elegant solutions. So the impacts come in 3 broad areas. The first one is naturalness, which are the normal things. So this is things like good daylighting, it's things like good air quality, temperature control. But then we also looked at 2 other big areas. One is the level of stimulation, and this is driven by the colour of the classroom, the visual complexity of the classroom. And here we found something which wasn't known before, which is a moderate amount of stimulation is optimal for learning. And the last area was individualization in terms of flexibility and ownership of the classroom. In other words, not being an anonymous box. In terms of colours, it's not really specific colours, it's a matter of the brightness and the impact they have on us in terms of stimulation. So really we're talking about brightness and how much. So a bright yellow classroom on every wall would be too much. A completely white classroom would be understimulating, and so it's somewhere in between. It's actually easy to see but quite hard to describe. Individualization was probably the most novel of the areas we looked at. It's quite hard to measure and it's not often been studied. So what we did was we decomposed it into two aspects: flexibility and the actual distinctiveness of the classroom. So flexibility is to do with choice, it's to do with learning zones and whether the children can actually have options in terms of how they go about their learning. The distinctiveness is different. It's about the way in which the classroom isn't an anonymous box, the way the classroom actually can feel as though it's owned by those children. It's got their work on the walls, their names on the trays, and it feels as though it's very much their space. They should walk in and they should say, "This is our classroom." There's two aspects to the furniture. One is the degree to which it's age appropriate. So we're actually talking about furniture that really suits young children, and you might think that's always the case, but it's not. And it's also the quality of the furniture. If there's good quality furniture, it obviously sends a message to the children about how much they're valued. And then there's the aspect of flexibility in the furniture, which we didn't see a huge amount of in the English schools we looked at, but obviously there's massive potential to actually build flexibility into how the classroom works by having furniture that's easily movable, that's height adjustable, etc. There's quite a few things teachers can do almost immediately that needn't cost any money possibly, or much money. And I mean, the obvious thing first of all for them is to actually see how they've dressed the classroom in terms of the level of stimulation they're creating. And it's quite common for classrooms to be pretty chaotic, actually, rather complicated, and sometimes they need simplifying, but we're not talking about making them boring, we're just saying get the balance right somewhere in the middle. The other thing they can do is consider the colours in the classroom and try and again get the level of stimulation about in that midpoint. And of course they've got a lot of options in terms of how they lay the classroom out, how they create zones with furniture, how they provide different opportunities for the pupils to learn through those spaces and through the different options they present. So in terms of different subjects, we were really studying all of the subjects because they're all learnt in the same space at primary level. But we did reanalyse the data in relation to separate subjects and came out with some really surprising results. One in particular was that for maths, the individualisation of the space becomes hugely important. And we think this is connected with confidence issues and children feeling it's their space, and so maybe finding it easier to address what for some is a really difficult subject. We also found that in relation to writing, which is perhaps the most creative of the subjects, links to nature suddenly became important, whereas in general it didn't jump out of the analysis. And we think that's linked to naturalness, nature, creativity, and a whole literature that says that's a beneficial connection. So there is a question as to what extent our work translates into other parts of the world. And we would make an argument which we're quite sure about, which is that we're talking about a model that is person-centric. We're talking about how people are affected by spaces, and so people have a lot of commonalities wherever they are in the world. There'll be some differences in culture, some differences in different tastes and preferences, but fundamentally we're talking about spaces that are healthy and conducive to learning, and we would expect that very much to translate. And certainly this is the case at the level of principals. So for instance, in relation to different principles, the principle, let's take lighting, would be that there's a good level of natural lighting, that you can feel the passage of the day, but there's also good artificial lighting, and there's not glare. How you achieve that in one country could be quite different from how you achieve it in another country, but the principle translates without really being changed. So in terms of the messages for the people building the schools of the future, The important thing is that you don't just build schools because you need a place for a child in a particular location. That if you're going to invest in building a school, you should build a school that's really, really good for learning. And this is an aspect that's been rather underplayed in the past. And so what we hope our results do is exemplify the things that need to be taken into account to create good learning spaces. And certainly the World Bank is taking up this message. We're working with them to try and make sure that when they invest all around the world, they do so taking these things into account as well as the basic provision of places. This work is significant because it's the first time that the specific effect of the spaces has been separated out from all the other influences to really understand how classroom design impacts on learning. You'd have thought that was a simple thing to do, but it turns out it's actually very complicated, and we've got an approach to it that's enabled us to do that. And this approach is being used elsewhere, and in years to come I'm sure more evidence will emerge that actually confirms our results.